The sea closed, the enemies sank, and 3 days later the people who had witnessed the greatest miracle in ancient history were on the verge of revolt, not against Pharaoh, against God. There are 7 things that happened between the crossing of the Red Sea and Mount Sinai, and most of them have been erased from collective memory. One of them will completely change what you think about faith, about miracles, and about what happens to a people when the danger disappears and routine begins. When most people think of the Exodus, they think of 2 moments, the plagues and the crossing. The sea opens, the people pass through, the waters engulf the Egyptian army, the end, credits. The rest of the story sits hunched in chapters that few read carefully, squeezed between the grandeur of the miracle and the solemnity of Mount Sinai. But it is precisely there, in that interval that seems empty, that the most human, most brutal, and most revealing story of the Old Testament takes place. And there is a detail about what happened in the first weeks after the crossing that the records almost conceal. An event that occurred before any crisis, before any miracle in the desert, before any complaint. A moment that defines everything that comes after. You will understand when you get there. For now, put yourself in the perspective of what it means to be on this side of the sea. There are approximately 2 million people. Some conservative scholars work with 600,000 adult men of fighting age, which, adding women, children, the elderly and the mixed multitude of peoples who followed Israel out of Egypt, easily reaches 2 million souls. 2 million. Try to grasp that number in the context of the 2nd millennium before Christ. The city of Thebes, the capital of Egypt at the height of its power, had at most 100,000 inhabitants. Rome, in the 1st century before Christ, had around 1 million. You are looking at a human column, larger than any city in the ancient world, in motion, in the desert, without a map, without a fixed destination on the immediate horizon, without an organized supply system, without a tested civilian chain of command. And they had just witnessed the greatest miracle any human being had ever seen. Think about what that means emotionally. You spent decades, you personally, your parents, your grandparents, in slavery. Not the softened slavery we sometimes imagine, but the work of clay and straw under 40-degree heat, with armed overseers, with children being thrown into the Nile by royal decree, with the weight of an entire nation pressing on your curved back. And then, in less than a year, you saw 10 plagues devastate the most formidable power in the known world. You crossed a sea on foot, with walls of water on both sides. Exodus chapter 14 verse 22 describes it with a precision that still paralyzes today. The waters were a wall to the right and to the left, and now you are on the other side, looking at the place where the most feared army of the ancient world sank like stone. The silence that followed must have been deafening, but the silence did not last long. This is the first of the 7 things, and it is the one that least seems like a thing, because it happens before the problem, before the crisis, before any difficulty. It is what Israel did immediately after the waters closed, and what they did says more about human nature than any of the crises that came afterward. They sang, Exodus chapter 15, the Song of Moses. It is the oldest poem in the Bible that we have in a relatively complete form. Some scholars date its composition close to the event itself, which would make it one of the oldest texts in the Western world still in liturgical use. And it was not Moses singing alone while the people watched in respectful silence. The text describes Moses leading the men in response, and immediately afterward, his sister Miriam, identified as a prophetess in Exodus 15 verse 20, taking tambourines and leading all the women in dance. All the women, 2 million people in spontaneous celebration on the shores of the sea, with percussion, with movement, with alternating song between men and women, with an explosion of collective joy that has no parallel in any other moment of the Pentateuch. Can you imagine the sound of that? Tambourines multiplied by tens of thousands. voices in unison carrying decades of compressed pain and hurling them to the sky in the form of praise. The rhythmic trembling of feet on the parched ground. The heat still present in the air, the salty mist of the nearby sea, and that enormous multitude, that people who had spent centuries bent over, finally standing, dancing. What the records show is that this celebration was not organized. There was no rehearsal. There was no prior convocation. Miriam picked up a tambourine, which she had kept while fleeing Egypt, which she had carried through the sea, and began, and the women followed. This reveals something profound about how this people processed the experience of the sacred, not in contemplative silence, not in structured ceremony, but in a whole-body collective eruption. But the song also reveals something else, something that most people do not notice when they read chapter 15 of Exodus. The song already anticipates arrival at the Promised Land. Verses 13 to 17 speak of guiding the people to the mount of God's inheritance, of planting them in the place of the divine dwelling. This means that in that moment, still with the salt of the sea in their hair, still with feet damp from ground that hours before had been covered in water, Israel was looking forward, not back. The memory of Egypt was still fresh, the miracle was still unfolding before their eyes, and there was already a collective sense that this was the beginning of something, not the end. That will be important, because everything that comes afterward will test exactly that vision. 3 days later, the celebration had ended completely. This is the second thing, and it is where the story turns upside down. Exodus 15, verse 22. Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went out into the desert of Shur. And they traveled for 3 days in the desert without finding water. 3 days. Examine what that means in physical terms. An adult human being, under normal conditions, begins to suffer significant dehydration after 24 hours without water. In desert conditions, intense heat during the day, constant sweating, the physical exertion of travel, that time frame is shorter. Now multiply that by 2 million people, including small children and newborns, elderly people who made the crossing alongside everyone else, animals that carried belongings and served as a food source. 72 hours without water in the desert of Shur. The desert of Shur was located in the region of what is today the northwest of the Sinai Peninsula, on the border with what we today call the Suez Canal. It is a region of limestone hills, arid soil, sparse vegetation, and no visible springs. Daytime temperatures can exceed 40 degrees Celsius. There was no shade, there were no rivers, there was no logistical supply infrastructure. Because there is no logistical infrastructure for 2 million people crossing a desert. And then, when they finally found water, after 3 days of marching in, which children must have cried with thirst, in which the animals must have begun to falter, in which the elderly must have needed help to continue, when they finally found water, the water was undrinkable. Marah. In Hebrew, Marah means bitter. The place was named for its water, not for its history, not for a previous event, for the taste that destroyed the hope of 2 million people who had walked 3 days waiting for exactly that moment. What goes through the mind of a mother who watches her thirsty child finally reach the edge of a spring and realizes the water will cause harm? What goes through the mind of an elder who survived decades of slavery, who saw the plagues, who crossed the sea, who danced with tambourines, and is now on his knees before a bitter pool with a dry throat and no way out in sight? The text of Exodus 15, verse 24, uses a specific verb. The people grumbled against Moses. In Hebrew, the verb is lun, and it will appear many other times in the weeks that follow. Lun is not a mild complaint. It is a prolonged grumbling, a vocal insurgency, a protest that begins individually and becomes collective. It is the sound of 2 million people who 3 days earlier were singing now, transforming that same volume of voice into grievance. Here is the detail that most people ignore when reading this passage. They were not wrong to be thirsty. They were not wrong to feel despair before bitter water after 3 days of marching. The problem was not the emotion, it was the target. The grumbling was not directed at God, it was directed at Moses, as if Moses had chosen that route, as if the bitterness of the water were the fault of the one leading them, as if anyone at all, could have done differently. Moses then did what Moses always does. He cried out to God, and what God did is one of the most discreet, most surgically precise miracles of the entire Exodus narrative. There was no thunder, there was no pillar of fire, there was no audible voice from heaven for all to hear. Exodus 15, verse 25 describes it thus: "The Lord showed him a tree, and Moses threw it into the water, and the water became sweet." A tree, or a branch. The Hebrew text uses the word etz, which can mean tree or wood. A piece of organic material thrown into bitter water that transforms the taste and saves 2 million lives. There is no scientific consensus on which plant could have this purifying effect. Some traditions point to specific species known to the Bedouins of the region for their alkaline properties. Others understand the event as a direct miracle, with no natural intermediary mechanism. What the text takes care to record is the humble instrument used, not a voice from heaven, not a pillar of light, not a visible angel, a tree, a stick, the common matter of the world as a vehicle of the extraordinary. And then, still in the same verse, after the sweet water comes something that is generally completely ignored in the popular narrative of the Exodus. God establishes statutes and ordinances in the middle of the desert, with the people still carrying thirst in their memory. Before any structure, before Sinai, before the stone tablets, God begins to teach. Verse 26 of Exodus 15 brings the first conditional promise after the crossing. "If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." The divine name revealed in that moment is Yahweh Roph, the Lord who heals, not the Lord who opens seas, not the Lord who destroys armies, the Lord who heals. As if the crisis of the bitter water were not merely a logistical test, but a spiritual diagnosis, the first assessment of how this people would respond to difficulty once the spectacular miracle had passed and the everyday desert had begun. And shortly after, the third thing. They arrived at Elim. Elim is one of the most underestimated places in the entire journey of the Exodus. After the bitterness of Marah, after the grumbling, after the discreet miracle with the tree, they arrived at Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the waters. Exodus 15, verse 27. 12 springs, 70 palm trees, 2 million people. Can you grasp what 12 springs of water means for 2 million people? Mathematically, each spring would have to supply approximately 166,000 people. That is impossible in terms of the capacity of a natural spring, which suggests either that the population numbers were smaller than traditional estimates, or that there were other water resources in the region beyond those listed, or simply that the sacred text records the symbolic number 12, corresponding to the 12 tribes of Israel, without logistical precision. But the detail that matters is another: 70 palm trees in a desert region, a real oasis with running water, with shade, with the possibility of rest. After everything, the final 3 plagues they also witnessed: the night of the 10th blow, the haste of departure, the night on the shores of the sea with the Egyptian army approaching, The crossing, the celebration, the 3 days without water, the bitterness of Marah. They stopped in the shade. The text does not record how long they stayed at Elim. We do not know. It may have been days, it may have been weeks. The text's silence about that period is almost as eloquent as everything it records. Because Elim has no drama, no crisis, no spectacular miracle, it has only rest. And rest in a high-tension narrative like the Exodus is itself a form of grace. The pause before the next challenge, the breath before the next crisis. But the next challenge was coming, and it would be greater than the thirst of Marah. From the desert of Shur, passing through Elim, Israel entered the desert of Sin, between Elim and Sinai, and it was there that the fourth thing happened, the one that most clearly exposes the collective psychology of a people who had just been freed and still did not know what to do with freedom. Exodus chapter 16, verse 3. And here you need to stop and read carefully, because this sentence will surprise you. The children of Israel said, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full." Pots of meat, bread to the full. They were talking about Egypt, the land where their children were thrown into the Nile, the land where they worked like animals under overseers with whips, the land whose army had just sunk in the sea they crossed on foot. And they were nostalgic, not for a freedom they had lost, not for a previous life of dignity, for the pots of meat. What does this reveal about the human mind? About how slavery functions not only as an external system, but as an internal structure that continues operating even after the physical chains have been removed. What leads an entire people who had just seen the power of Egypt destroyed so absolutely that there was no longer even an army to fear, to feel nostalgia for the food of captivity? Follow the logic for a moment. In Egypt, there was certainty. The certainty of suffering, yes, but certainty. You knew what you would eat. You knew where you would sleep. You knew, even if in a brutal way, your place within the system. In the desert, there was no certainty whatsoever. There was freedom, but freedom is frightening when you do not know what to do with it. When the horizon has no border and the path has no pavement and tomorrow has no guarantee, the human mind begins to build nostalgia for the very prison it left. Modern psychologists have a name for this phenomenon. Research on what they call the paradox of choice consistently shows that an excess of freedom can generate paralysis and anxiety. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, wrote about how liberated prisoners sometimes could not process freedom suddenly returned to them, because the structure of captivity had become the structure of the mind. Israel, in the desert of sin, was experiencing the ancient and collective version of that same phenomenon, and God responded to the grumbling not with punishment, but with bread. That is the fifth thing, the manna. And it is where the story begins to reveal a logistical and spiritual engineering of a complexity that most people have never stopped to calculate. Exodus 16, verse 4, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you." But the verse continues with an instruction that defines everything. "And the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, a day's portion every day, not a week's portion, not a month's stock, the day's portion today." The manna was a forced system of daily dependence. There was no accumulating. There was no stockpiling for the security of tomorrow. Exodus 16, verse 20, describes what happened to those who tried to save some for the next day. It bred worms and stank. The only exception was the eve of the Sabbath. On that day, double was gathered, because on the Sabbath the manna did not appear. And the double portion not rotting on the eve of the Sabbath was itself a weekly miracle, repeated every week for 40 years. Calculate the magnitude of that. 1 omer per person per day. An omer equals approximately 2 liters and 200 milliliters in volume. Multiply by 2 million people, by 365 days a year, by 40 years. The numbers reach a scale that has no equivalent in any supply system in human history. And the sacred text asserts that this system functioned without interruption for 4 decades until Israel set foot on the soil of Canaan and ate of the fruit of the promised land. Joshua chapter 5 verse 12. And the manna ceased on the day after, when they had eaten of the produce of the land. But there is a detail about the manna that most people have never noticed. The manna required work. It was not food deposited at the door of each tent. It was something that appeared on the ground, described in Exodus 16 verse 14 as a fine flake-like thing, like frost on the face of the desert, and that had to be gathered in the morning before the sun grew hot and melted it. This means that each family had a mandatory daily work schedule. They went out early, they gathered, they returned, and only then did they eat. The miracle did not eliminate effort, it created a routine around it. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the biblical narrative. The miracle does not replace human participation, it only transforms it. The sea did not cross the people crossed the sea. The tree did not purify the water on its own. Moses threw it into the water. The manna did not fly into the tents. Each family went to fetch it. There was always a human gesture as an intermediary between divine provision and consumption, and along with the manna came the quail. Exodus 16 verse 13. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp of 2 million people. The migration of quail is a real and documented phenomenon in the Sinai region. Birds that cross the Mediterranean Sea, coming from Europe during spring, exhausted after the crossing, landing in large quantities on the coast and in adjacent desert regions. What the text describes as a miracle has a natural identifiable mechanism. And scholars debate to this day whether the divine intervention was in the natural mechanism or in the precise coincidence of time and place. But the people in the desert were not making that analysis. They were eating. After weeks of manna, they had meat. The text, however, does not linger on the quail. They arrive and the narrative moves on, because the next crisis was already forming. The 6th thing happened at Rephidim, and it is one of the most disturbing in the post-crossing sequence, not for what happens, which is another water miracle, but for the level of tension Israel had reached before the miracle. Exodus 17 verse 2, and the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" The Hebrew verb here is rib, which means to litigate, to dispute judicially, to argue with formal authority. It was no longer the grumbling of Mara. It was no longer the collective muttering of the desert of sin. It was direct confrontation, formal accusation. And verse 4 reveals the true level of tension. Moses cried out to the Lord and said, "What shall I do with this people? A little more, and they will stone me." Moses, the man who had faced Pharaoh, who had stretched out his staff over the sea, who had led 2 million people through the impossible, was afraid of being stoned by his own people. Can you feel the weight of that? It is not abstract fear. It is the specific fear of a leader who perceives he has lost authority, who looks at a crowd with stones in their hands and no longer sees respect in those people's eyes. He sees hunger. He sees accumulated anger. He sees despair transformed into aggression. What happens in the mind of a man who spent decades preparing for this moment, who faced Pharaoh without flinching and is now trembling before his own people? And God's answer, once again, was to use what was at hand: the staff, the rock, common materials. Exodus 17 verse 6. "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so, water from a rock in the desert. The place was called Massah and Meribah, which in Hebrew mean testing and quarreling. The very name became a permanent record of the crisis, the rock that gave water in a place forever marked as where Israel tested God's patience. But Rephidim did not end with the water. Because it was at Rephidim that the seventh thing happened, the one that least seems spiritual, the one that seems most simply brutal, the first battle of Israel as a free nation. The Amalekites attacked. Exodus 17, verse 8. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Amalek was a nomadic people descended from Esau, therefore a distant relative of Israel, who controlled trade and pastoral routes in the region of the Negev and Sinai. For them, a column of 2 million people crossing the desert represented two things: a territorial threat and an opportunity. Deuteronomy 25. Verse 18 reveals what the biblical records call the cowardice of the attack. The Amalekites attacked from the rear, choosing those who were tired, those who lagged behind, the weakest in the column. This was not a battle between armies, it was a hunt. And Israel had no army, it had a people. It had former slaves who had never fought in formation, who had never received military training, who carried construction tools, not swords, not spears, not battle-tested shields. The only weaponry Israel had upon leaving Egypt was what they had asked from the Egyptians before departing, the gold and silver they had received as payment for the centuries of forced labor. There was no cavalry, there were no war chariots, there was no established military strategy. And then Moses did something that would define the future of Israel for centuries. He called Joshua. Joshua appears here for the first time, Exodus 17 verse 9, with no prior introduction, with no backstory provided by the text. Moses simply calls him and says, "Choose men for us and go out and fight Amalek." This man, who will become Moses' successor and the conqueror of Canaan, who will lead the people across the Jordan as Moses had led them across the sea, who will command the fall of Jericho and the division of the promised land among the tribes. This man appears without ceremony, without a recorded anointing, without a vision or dramatic call. He is summoned to a battle and goes, and here is the detail that completely transforms the meaning of that battle. While Joshua fought in the valley, Moses went up to the top of the hill with the staff of God in his hand. And what happened next is one of the most visually extraordinary events in the entire Exodus narrative, and also the most ignored when people speak about the 7 things after the sea. Exodus 17, verses 11 and 12. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. And whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side, and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. Moses, 80 years old at that point, Exodus 7. Verse 7 dates his age at the start of the confrontation with Pharaoh, sitting on a stone on top of a hill, with his arms raised, with Aaron on one side and Hur on the other, holding up his arms that had no more strength. The victory of an entire army depending on the raised arms of an exhausted old man, held up by 2 men who simply would not let him fall. Examine the details of that scene. Aaron was Moses' brother, the spokesman, the priest, the man who had spoken to Pharaoh when Moses said he was heavy-tongued. Hur is mentioned briefly at other points in the text. There is a Jewish tradition that identifies him as Miriam's son, which would make him Moses' nephew. 2 men, a stone, 2 old arms, and the battle in the valley, invisible to them, being decided by something that was not physical strength, not military strategy, not numbers of soldiers. It was the position of Moses' arms. What does this mean? What are the records trying to communicate with this specific image? Follow the reasoning. The victory of Israel did not come from Israel. The capacity to fight was Joshua's and the chosen men's. The intercession was Moses. The support was Aaron's and Hur's. None of them would have been sufficient alone. Joshua, without the intercession at the top of the hill, would have lost the battle. The text makes this explicit. Moses, without Aaron and Hur, would have lowered his arms. The text says his hands grew heavy. The victory was structurally collective, and each component was irreplaceable. And at the end of the day, Israel defeated Amalek, not destroyed, not annihilated, defeated on that day. The text records no casualty numbers. It does not describe the exultation. It describes only what God said to Moses immediately afterward. Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, the order to record, to preserve, to ensure that what happened at Rephidim that day would not be forgotten. And Moses built an altar, the first altar built by Israel as a free nation. He called it Yahweh Nissi, the Lord is my banner, not the Lord is my warrior, not the Lord destroyed my enemy. The Lord is my banner, the standard under which one fights, the symbol that gives identity to what is being defended. Think about the sequence of what you have just followed. In less than 2 months, the exact date is not provided, but Exodus 16 verse 1 says they arrived at the desert of Sin on the 15th day of the 2nd month after the departure from Egypt, which places the Amalekite attack at some point after that. This people experienced the euphoria of the open sea, the silence of the first step on the other side, the explosion of song, the brutal thirst of 3 days, the bitterness of Marah, the rest of Elim, the nostalgia for Egyptian captivity, the daily bread falling from heaven, the quarrel at Rephidim, the water from the rock, and the first war of a nation that had never formed an army. 7 things, 7 moments, each with its own logic, its own crisis, its own revelation. And there is a thread that runs through all 7. It is not the faithfulness of Israel, which was inconsistent to say the least. It is not the perfection of Moses, who doubted himself, who asked to have his arms held up, who was corrected and limited at points that the text does not conceal. The thread is the consistency of what was on the other side of the equation. The response to grumbling was the manna. The response to thirst was the water. The response to attack was the victory. The response to straying was correction, not abandonment. There is something profoundly disturbing about this consistency when you stop to think. Not disturbing as a threat, disturbing as depth, because it means that the provision was not conditional on gratitude. The manna did not come because Israel sang beautifully on the shores of the sea. It came because Israel was hungry. The water did not come out of the rock because Moses remained calm and confident. It came out because the people were thirsty and angry and threatening to stone the leader. The victory over Amalek did not come because Israel had a disciplined army and a brilliant strategy. It came through old arms held up by 2 men on a rock at the top of a hill. What do you do with that? The text does not answer directly. There is no explicit sermon. There is no divine narrator who appears to explain the theological point. There is only the record. What happened, how it happened, who was there, and you, from the other side of more than 3,000 years, reading these 7 things that happened after the sea closed, you are invited to draw your own conclusion. But before concluding, there is one final layer. Joshua, who was called without ceremony to lead a battle at Rephidim, who had never commanded anything before that day, who won with old arms held up by 2 men as the only supernatural support available, that man will be the next to face an impossible river. Decades later, when Moses dies, when the generation of Egypt has passed, when the sons and grandsons of those who cross the sea need to cross the Jordan to enter the promised land, who will be at the edge of the river? Joshua. And God will speak to him with an instruction that echoes directly from Rephidim. Be strong and courageous. Not be strong and courageous because you have an army. Not be strong and courageous because the road is clear. Be strong and courageous because the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Joshua's formation began before Sinai, before the law, before the stone tablets. It began in an improvised battle, on a day when no one knew it would be the beginning of something. Rephidim was the school of a general who did not yet know he was a general. And the lesson was not about military strategy, it was about where to fix your eyes when your arms grow heavy and the enemy is still on the field. The manna lasted 40 years, counted from the 15th day of the second month of the first year after Egypt, until the day Israel ate of the produce of Canaan for the first time. 40 years of daily provision, without interruption, without a single day of shortage recorded. Every morning, before the sun grew hot, the portion was on the ground. Every Friday, double, so that the Sabbath could be kept. Every family, every person, every child born in the desert who had never seen Egypt, all fed by something that the text calls simply bread from heaven. 2 million people, 40 years, in the desert. There is no logistical parallel for that at any point in human history. There is no supply system, no supply chain, no modern humanitarian operation capable of replicating what the text describes as routine. And the most disturbing detail, the one that is perhaps the most silent and the heaviest of all 7, is that at the end of the 40 years, when the manna ceased, the text records the event in just half a verse. Joshua 5 verse 12, one line. As if 40 years of daily miraculous provision were simply the normal that had existed and now ended because it was no longer needed. As if the extraordinary, when it lasts long enough, becomes invisible. That may be the most important lesson of the 7 things that happened after the sea closed. Not the grandeur of the miracle, not the spectacle of the parting of the waters, but what happens when the miracle becomes routine. When the daily provision is no longer something you marvel at and begins to be something you expect. When the bread from heaven becomes breakfast. And perhaps it is precisely there, in that transition from the spectacular to the ordinary, that the most real faith is tested, not on the shore of the sea with an army at your back, but on the common morning of some ordinary Tuesday, when you leave the tent to gather your day's portion, and the bread is there as it was yesterday, as it will be tomorrow, as it always has been, and you decide in that banal moment whether you will bend down to take it with gratitude or whether you will simply take it because it was always there. Miriam picked up a tambourine before crossing the sea. She carried it through the waters, and when she arrived on the other side, she played. Miriam's tambourine is not in the Cairo Museum. It did not survive. No artifact of this crossing has been recovered by archaeology, which is understandable, given that nomadic camps of populations without permanent structure rarely leave detectable traces. But the song she led is in the 15th chapter of Exodus, still there, still being sung in Jewish liturgies today, more than 3,000 years later. The name of the place where the water was bitter, Marah, remains in the toponymy of the Sinai region. The name of the altar built by Moses after the battle, Yahweh Nissi, entered the theological vocabulary of 3 monotheistic religions that, together, number more than 4 billion people in the 21st century. And Joshua, the man called without ceremony to fight a battle no one had foreseen, whose leader's arms were supported by the old arms of an 80-year-old man on a stone at the top of a hill. Joshua gave his name to the biblical book that records the entry into Canaan, and that same name, in its Greek form, is the name by which the entire world knows a Galilean who 20 centuries after Rephidim spoke of bread from heaven in a synagogue and claimed to be himself the manna that the desert had prefigured. Yehoshua, Jesus, Jesus. The story did not end when the sea closed. It was, at that moment, only beginning.